Throughout the world, vampires have existed in both legend and fact. Since time began, the superstition of men has led them to believe that other men arose from the grave in a restless and eternal prowling that could only be satiated by the sucking of a living victim's blood. Remarkably, there have been living men, no specters, but living men that have succumbed to this superstition and in their deranged minds believe themselves to be vampires. The list of men in the countries they represent is endless. Tonight, we'll look at some of those superstitions, their origins, causes of some of them, and we'll hear an original vampire drama. This is Halloween night on WKBW Radio in Buffalo. I'm Jim McLaughlin. In the year 1733, John Heinrich Zopfius, a German scientist fascinated with the occult world, described vampires as those that issue from their graves in the night, attacking people who are sleeping in their beds, sucking all the blood from their bodies, and destroying them. Now, as any self-respecting vampire will tell you, and as vampire lore will bear out, vampires did not always take enough blood from a person to kill them. Victims of vampires, or those suspected of being victims of vampires, often complained of a lassitude, no energy, tired, run down, iron-poor blood. The vampires sometimes made several visits to the same victim, especially if they were attractive young ladies. Zopfius points out in a later chapter of his book that victims that lingered often volunteered at the point of death that someone who had lately died had risen from their tomb to torment, torture, and kill them. A more contemporary definition of a vampire can be found in Webster. A blood-sucking ghost or reanimated body of a dead person believed to come from the grave and wander about by night, sucking the blood of persons asleep and causing their deaths. Webster apparently feels much more definite about the mortality rate than Zopfius does. Blood, of course, is the overriding factor of vampirism. As this material was researched, the writer was faced with great gouts of blood and gore. It gets a little sticky. But blood plays a key role in the origins of the vampire myth. Superstition is rampant, and many historians report that early superstitions were fostered by the church at the dawn of Christianity because they damned it as the work of the devil, therefore giving credence to what might have been described as old wives' tales. Christians, however, take wine at their communion services representing the blood of Christ. The Jews, although forbidden to consume blood, pour it on the ground in sacrificial rites to return its strength to the soil. Pagan warriors often licked it from their spears or drank it from their opponents to absorb his strength into their own bodies. The explanations for the vampire theory are many. They begin with cannibalism. Montluel, France, 1888. Justine Lafayette and Martin de Malade marry, and the countryside is ravaged with an outbreak of cannibalism and vampirism.
Martin du Malade is a young man, handsome and devil-may-care.
Justine is a huge slab of a woman, prone to use drugs and revel in all forms of excess. Justine, as grotesque a creature that you would hope to find, could never in her wildest dreams expect young Martin to marry her. Martin is the rake of the town, and although he's shunned by wily parents, he's the apple of the eye of many of the young maidens. The story unfolds in this way. Justine, fat, ugly, mustachioed woman that she is, drugs young Martin and introduces him to the arts of the occult, black masses, fetishism, all the things she delights in. Unfortunately for the young man, his mind is not capable of withstanding the assault of Justine, aided by the continued use of drugs, and he snaps. Somewhere, deep in his mind, is a desire for flesh and blood. He makes his first kill, a 15-year-old girl behind a warehouse, slits her throat and drinks. The body is discovered drained of life's fluid, and neat, precise cuts taken from the arms and legs. Now, a rain of terror falls over the quiet French town that reduces the streets to echo carriers after nightfall. For the next 5 years, Martin would strike more than 80 times. Each time, the same discovery. The blood drained, the flesh cut away. Finally, they are caught. Justine had waxed even fatter on her unusual diet, and Martin was a slobbering animal, devoid of any sense, any at all, a vegetable. Martin was in a very real sense a vampire. A human, as opposed to the dictionary definition type of being risen from the grave, to be sure, but nevertheless, a vampire. Although incidents like this are scattered in countries throughout the world, the heart, the very heart of the vampire legend, made its strongest foothold in the Balkan countries. It still exists today, as deeply as it did years and years ago.
It was not uncommon for people to be buried alive at this time. Medical procedures, when available, which they most likely were not in the small villages, were hopelessly inadequate. Diagnosis and treatment were largely farm remedies, and an individual suffering a stroke or a coma could be easily mistaken for dead and buried.
Then comes the exhumation party to see if the dead one has gone to heaven. Open the grave. Pry open the lid of the coffin. And now the real corpse is found in a different position. The shroud is torn and bloody, and often the fingertips, arms, and shoulders were bitten and gouged, and the coffin was filled with gore. Signs of a terrible struggle for freedom. This unfortunate person would then be represented as a blood-sucking vampire, or the victim of a vampire. Here was evidence in the minds of the villagers that a vampire had struck and had claimed this one as his own. It never occurred to them that it was the claustrophobic ragings of hopelessness that caused the biting and face-tearing in the struggle for air and life. The case histories go on and on and on. Hungary, 1856. Here it is customary to bury people in rows, one grave right next to another. A man dies of a strange malady and is buried. The next day, the gravedigger is preparing another pit when sounds of knocking are heard. Terrified, he reports it to the authorities, who at last get permission to open the grave and exhume the body. By the time this had been accomplished, the man had died in reality. The shroud is torn and bloodied. The man's body had been bitten and the coffin filled with his blood. The vampire's victim? Gypsies deep in the Carpathian Mountains believe that there are ways to determine the grave sites of vampires and ways to kill them. We'll explore those in a moment. The vampire throughout the world can be divided into two categories.
The spirit of a dead person is the first, rising ethereally like a mist from the grave and materializing into skin and bones. Or taking the form of a bat or a wolf, most commonly a werewolf in Transylvania, transfixing the intended victim with fear, either through the sheer apparition it presents or more often through hypnosis. The bat would always materialize into human form. Not so in the case of the werewolf, who was far down the cultural vampire ladder. The werewolf being somewhat untidy and prone to eat flesh as well as drink blood.
The second manifestation is a corpse who, reanimated by his own spirit or that of a demon, returns to suck the life of the living in order to maintain its own vitality. This legend was helped along by premature burial and exhumation. It's only natural you should die from loss of blood, says the peasant. Isn't it logical that you could be reborn by drinking it? The vampire always inhabited a grave, regardless of whether he was of the spirit category or the risen dead. Gypsy lore tells us that you can find a vampire grave by looking for the following things. Several holes above the head of the grave, about the width of a man's finger. There's no explanation for these holes or why they should be there. Presumably they are there for escape. Does the revealed corpse have
wide open eyes,
ruddy complexion,
nails and hair growing in light?
Are there marks on the neck or shoulders?
Is the shroud partially devoured?
Are the limbs flexible?
Is there blood in the coffin?
Sound familiar? All signs of premature death and burial. Or are they? There are other ways of discovering a vampire's grave.
A young, virtuous boy is placed on the back of a maiden mare, and the horse is led over the suspected graves, almost always fresh ones. If the horse crosses the grave without difficulty, all is well. If the mare should shy away from it, there is your vampire.
Once discovered, what do you do with a vampire? You drive a wooden stake through the heart. But the wood must come from maple, aspen, hawthorn, or blackthorn tree. You can impale the body on a stake. You can drive a common metal stake through the heart. This will only serve to keep the vampire in the coffin and not really destroy it. Should the stake be removed at a later date, the vampire would then be free to roam and terrorize the countryside again. And the first victim would be the luckless individual who pulled the stake from his heart.
Chopping off the head in upside-down suspension to drain the fluid from the body is another method. Shooting or stabbing through the heart with bullets or knives made of precious metals, gold and silver.
Tearing out the heart. Tearing is the most important word. In order for this to be effective, the heart must have been torn from the chest by hand, without the aid of any implement, and then either impaled on a wooden stake, stabbed with a silver or gold knife, shot with a silver or gold bullet, burned, and the ashes scattered, boiled in oil, or eaten by the village saint. The only thing wrong with the last is that the saint was likely to become a vampire as well. It depended on the strength of the faith of the individual, the watchfulness of his neighbors, and the depth of the local superstition. Burning the body was another method. But generally, any of these things that we have mentioned would do the job. And a combination of them was doubly effective.
In the Balkan countries, vampires do not cast shadows. The fact that the Balkan vampire came out only at night might contribute to this. They could only be destroyed by gypsies or witches, which was expensive and a long, drawn-out affair. How do you become a vampire? We'll take that up in a moment. To become a vampire, you must first and foremost be dead.
Well, that's essential.
To have committed suicide made you a prime candidate. To have been excommunicated by the church doubled your chances. Of course, a suicide case is automatically excommunicated, so how could you miss? And not to have received the full burial rites made your prospects of living on in the minds of your neighbors as a vampire extremely attractive. If the services had been interrupted by a death on the part of one of the celebrants, an occult occurrence, or to have had a bird rest on your coffin, or a horse cross your grave within minutes of burial, all the better. Strangely enough, children born on high holidays of the church were said to be prime candidates for vampirism. Stillborn children, of course, also fell into that category.
Those persons who have eaten the flesh of a sheep that was killed by a wolf were likely to become vampires. And those persons who had eaten the flesh of a sheep that was killed by a werewolf were doomed. You could only become a vampire if you were attacked by a vampire. Any of the reasons we mentioned before would enhance your chances of being attacked. Vampires were particularly attracted to young people and pretty girls. And as we said earlier, an attack did not necessarily lead to death. Several visits might be required before death came, especially if she were pretty. Those attacked by vampires while living were doomed to be vampires after death.
A woman in her 6th month of pregnancy, according to a Romanian legend, who was looked upon by a vampire, would bear a child that after death would become a vampire. If the child were a girl, she would be attacked repeatedly during life by the vampire and suffer no ill effects.
She would be, in our terms today, a service station until she suffered a natural death.
Children of vampires would be vampires, and if 2 successive children from the same family became vampires, then it was considered to be hereditary, and the village would discourage the mother from having more children by killing any that were born.
People who were loners, either witches or warlocks, stood an excellent chance of becoming vampires. A stunted leg or arm, any physical defect, made you a prime candidate. And if you were a little freaky, it was certain that the vampire would visit you, either before or after death, and inflict his curse. Can you imagine for a moment that such people, spirits, ethereal beings, might exist? Can you let your imagination run and say, yes, it might be so? Or would you be practical and scholarly and say that it's not possible? I've never seen one. No one has. Do you, for one moment, imagine that we see the 100,000th part of what exists? Consider for a moment the wind, the greatest of the forces of nature. It knocks men down, demolishes houses, uproots trees, stirs up the sea, drives great ships on the rocks. The wind whistles and groans and bellows and howls and roars and screams and whines and whinnies and sometimes kills. Have you ever seen it? The wind